I'm standing in the pattern shop here at Combe Mill, and as you've seen, we have 5 tower or church clocks here on display. The oldest is from 1543 and the youngest 1797. The clocks we have here span something like 250 years, and over that period there were vast developments in the anchor escapement, which is the time-keeping element of the clock. We have examples of the short pendulum with a verge. We have three examples of the recoil anchor escapement. We have a deadbeat escapement, which is a very fine and accurate device for church clocks. But I do also have a working example of a double 3-legged gravity escapement, just to round things off. So let me introduce you individually to each clock. This clock is a very precious clock to us. It is in fact one of the first pendulum clocks. It's a short pendulum with a verge escapement. It comes from St Peter and St Paul Church in Church Hanborough, and it is a clock. It's a clock because it only strikes a bell, and the Dutch word for bell is clock, and this is the origin, I think, of the word we use for these devices. There are no dial, there are no hands. This device purely allows the striking mechanism on the other side to strike the hours. It's very precious. It's not that accurate for the simple reason that to allow escapement, the pendulum, you'll see, has to swing a very, very long way. And if pendulums swing a long way, then they can't be as accurate as one would like them to be. More of that later when I talk about the anchor escapement. We've seen the short pendulum with the verge escapement and the inaccuracies caused by the large swing of the pendulum. The next development, and this clock was made about in 1680 by Edward Hemmings, we see an anchor escapement. We call it an anchor because it rather looks like an upside down anchor. The anchor escapement there allows the escapement with a very, very small pendulum movement. So any inaccuracies on this device here are almost overcome by this anchor escapement. We have another example here of a recoil anchor escapement, although it's only been that way fairly recently, because this clock in fact was made in 1543. It started life in a manor house, and when the manor house was knocked down, it went to a church in Stonesfield, and at the time it was only a single-handed clock. When the church wanted a better clock, it went to a garage a few miles away from here, and the mechanic there converted it into a double-handed clock and put in the anchor escapement because it couldn't possibly have had a pendulum in 1543 when it was first made. We have it here because it's an example of a pendulum in the center of the clock, which I've never seen before. I'm sure there are other examples around. The pendulum normally hangs down over the anchor and is being impulsed directly below. But as you see here, the pendulum is in the middle and there's a conrod to the anchor itself. It's rather unusual, and as I say, I haven't seen one before. And here we have another example of a recoil anchor escapement. I keep mentioning that word recoil. The escapement has two purposes. One is to measure small packages of time, to have one wheel going round in the same rate as the Earth is rotating, in other words, a clock. The other is to keeping the pendulum swinging. And as you watch this wheel, when it stops, it actually goes backwards slightly. It recoils, and that energy is felt down this crutch and is keeping the pendulum swinging. Hence the recoil anchor escapement. We now come to our youngest clock, built in 1797, and the escapement here is a deadbeat escapement. The others have been recoil, and this is deadbeat. It's deadbeat because the escape wheel, once it stops, does not go backwards. And if you've ever observed a long case clock, or you have one at home, then you're watching the second hand, it only goes one way, whereas the recoil escapements, the second hand goes slightly back, forwards, slightly back, forwards, slightly back, forwards. The advantage of this is that the errors incurred by the recoil are taken out by this deadbeat escapement. Now this is a very, very delicate escapement, and the impulse, because the pendulum has to be impulsed, the impulse is just the tip running down that little incline plane there. There, you could hardly imagine the force was going to be sufficient to keep that big pendulum swinging, but it is. This is a very, very accurate clock, up to there. Unfortunately, church clocks, tower clocks in general terms, once the hands are exposed to the elements, the birds, the ice, the rain, the snow, all sorts of things can affect the hands, put pressures down into the clock and make it go slower or faster. And so church clocks are inherently inaccurate, but this would be a very accurate clock, seconds a month, up to there.
Recording now.
Right, I mentioned the fact that these clocks are inherently inaccurate because the forces of nature on the hands affect the pendulum swing. This escapement was designed to overcome that problem. We've mentioned the impulse coming from the anchor. The impulse from this pendulum is purely by gravity. It's the weight of that elbow-shaped arm pushing, push, 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 push. And gravity doesn't change, doesn't alter unless we change our latitude or our altitude. And once that pendulum settles down, it does not change its arc regardless of what's happening to the hands on the tower. That's the Westminster clock, the double three-legged gravity escapement. Well, you've seen our individual clocks. If you want to know more, then come and visit Combe Mill on the third Sunday of any summer month.